At 9:51 p.m. on February 13, 1945, 22-year-old Lothar Metzger stood on the roof of his apartment building in Dresden, Germany, watching what appeared to be Christmas lights drifting down from the sky. They were beautiful, red and green flares floating gracefully through the darkness, illuminating the Baroque spires and churches that had earned Dresden the nickname Florence on the Elbe. Metzger had no way of knowing that those beautiful lights were target markers. That in exactly 7 minutes, 244 British Lancaster bombers would begin dropping incendiaries on the most concentrated civilian population in Europe. That he would spend the next 12 hours in a firestorm that would generate winds exceeding 100 miles per hour and temperatures reaching 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. That 25,000 people would die in a single night, most of them burned alive, boiled alive, or suffocated when the fire consumed all the oxygen in the air they were breathing. And that 80 years later, historians would still argue about whether it was a legitimate military operation or one of the greatest war crimes committed by the Allies. Dresden in February 1945 was a paradox. It was a city that had barely been touched by the war that was destroying the rest of Germany. While Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, and Frankfurt had been devastated by years of Allied bombing, Dresden had been spared. The city had no major military installations, no tank factories, no submarine pens, no industrial targets that typically drew Allied attention. What Dresden did have was beauty, Gothic churches, Baroque palaces, art museums containing priceless collections. A historic city center that had survived centuries intact. Dresden was a cultural treasure, the kind of city that both sides tacitly agreed should be preserved if possible. But by February 1945, the tacit agreements were breaking down. The war was ending. Soviet forces were advancing from the east. American and British forces were advancing from the west. Germany was being crushed between two massive armies, and the German military was collapsing. Dresden had become something else, a refugee city. The population had swollen from 630,000 to over 1 million people. Refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet army had poured into Dresden from the east, women, children, elderly people, all of them running from the Red Army's reputation for rape and massacre. They came to Dresden because it seemed safe. The city had no strategic importance. It had been left alone for years. Surely it would remain a sanctuary until the war ended. They were wrong. On February 13, 1945, Allied command made the decision to destroy Dresden. The official justification: Dresden was a transportation hub. Rail lines running through the city were being used to move German troops and supplies to the Eastern Front. Destroying Dresden would disrupt German logistics and help the Soviet advance. The unofficial reason: show the Soviets what Allied air power could do. The relationship between the Western Allies and the USSR was already deteriorating. Stalin was demanding proof that Britain and America were serious about defeating Germany. A massive demonstration of bombing power would send a message. And there was a third reason, never stated officially but understood by everyone involved: payback. Germany had started the war with terror bombing Rotterdam, Warsaw, London, Coventry. The Blitz had killed over 40,000 British civilians. Now, in February 1945, with victory certain, there was an appetite for revenge. Dresden would be the target. Air Marshal Arthur "Bomber" Harris, commander of RAF Bomber Command, planned the operation personally. Harris believed in area bombing, destroying entire cities rather than precision targeting of military installations. His philosophy was simple: break German civilian morale and the war would end faster. The raid on Dresden would be the ultimate area bombing campaign. not targeting factories or rail yards specifically, but the entire historic city center where refugees were packed into every available building. The plan called for 2 waves of bombers separated by 3 hours, a deliberate tactic designed to maximize casualties. The first wave would drop incendiaries to start fires and destroy buildings. The second wave would arrive after rescue workers and firefighters had deployed, hitting them while they worked. Then, the following day, American bombers would hit the city again in daylight. It was systematic. It was calculated. It was designed to kill as many people as possible. At 9:51 p.m. on February 13th, the first Pathfinder aircraft arrived over Dresden. They dropped parachute flares, the Christmas lights that Lothar Metzger watched from his rooftop. The flares illuminated the city center, marking the aiming point for the bombers following behind. At 10:09 p.m. the first wave began, 244 Lancaster bombers, each carrying a mix of high-explosive bombs and incendiaries. The high explosives hit first. They didn't cause the most casualties directly. They served a different purpose, blowing the roofs off buildings, shattering windows, creating openings where air could flow. Then came the incendiaries. Each Lancaster dropped dozens of incendiary bombs, magnesium cylinders that burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees. They ignited everything they touched: wooden roof beams, furniture, curtains, paper, clothing. Within minutes, hundreds of fires were burning across the city center. Lothar Metzger watched the first bombs fall from his rooftop. He saw explosions across the Altstadt, the old town, creating fountains of sparks and debris. He saw fires igniting in buildings a mile away. Then an incendiary landed on his own building. The magnesium bomb punched through the roof 3 floors below him and ignited in an apartment. Flames erupted from the windows within seconds. Metzger ran for the stairs, joining dozens of other residents fleeing the burning building. They poured into the street and immediately faced a nightmare. The entire city was on fire. Not one building, not one block. The entire historic center of Dresden was burning simultaneously. Fires stretched in every direction as far as Metzger could see. The smoke was so thick it blocked out the stars, and the bombers were still overhead, dropping more incendiaries. The fires began merging. Small fires joined into large fires joined into conflagrations. The conflagrations began generating their own weather. This is what happens when you set an entire city on fire at once. The heat rises, creating a low-pressure zone at ground level. Cool air rushes in from the surroundings to fill the vacuum. As the fire intensifies, the air rushes in faster and faster. Eventually, you create a firestorm. By 10:45 p.m., less than 40 minutes after the first bombs fell, Dresden was experiencing a full firestorm. Winds at ground level reached 100+ miles per hour, roaring toward the fire like a hurricane. The temperature in the fire zone exceeded 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. People caught in the open were swept off their feet by the winds and blown into burning buildings. Those who grabbed onto lampposts or railings to resist the wind had their hands burned off by the superheated metal. The wind was so strong it uprooted trees, tore shutters from buildings, and sent debris flying through the air like shrapnel. And it was feeding the fire. The hurricane-force winds were drawing oxygen into the flames, making them burn hotter and faster. The fire was consuming entire buildings in minutes. Margaret Freyer, a 27-year-old secretary, was trying to reach a public shelter when the firestorm developed. She described the experience in her diary. The wind was like a tornado. I could barely stand. People around me were being lifted off the ground and thrown into the flames. I saw a woman holding her child, both of them on fire, spinning in the wind like a Catherine wheel before disappearing into the smoke. I tried to run, but there was nowhere to run. Every direction was fire. The heat was so intense my clothes began smoldering. I fell to the ground and crawled, trying to find air to breathe, but the fire was consuming the oxygen. I watched people's clothing spontaneously ignite from the heat even though no flames touched them. Their hair caught fire. Their skin blistered and peeled. They screamed, but I couldn't hear them over the roar of the wind and the fire. I don't know how I survived. I crawled into a water reservoir, a public fountain, and submerged myself. The water was boiling. I could feel my skin cooking, but staying underwater was better than burning in the air. I stayed there for 3 hours, coming up only to breathe, watching people around the reservoir catch fire and die. The public bomb shelters became death traps. Dresden had extensive underground shelter systems, basements and cellars reinforced to protect against bomb blasts. Thousands of people crowded into these shelters when the air raid sirens sounded, believing they would be safe underground. They were wrong. The shelters protected against explosions. They did nothing against fire and heat. As the firestorm intensified above ground, the temperature in the shelters began rising. The fire was consuming oxygen faster than it could be replaced. Carbon monoxide from burning buildings seeped into the shelters through ventilation systems. People in the shelters began suffocating. Some tried to leave, opening the shelter doors to escape, and were immediately incinerated by the firestorm outside. The superheated air rushing into the shelter killed everyone near the entrance. Others stayed sealed in the shelters and died more slowly, choking on carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, their bodies overheating as the surrounding earth conducted heat from the fires above. Entire shelters were found after the fires burned out, containing hundreds of bodies. Some showed no external injuries. They had simply suffocated or cooked in the heat. Others had tried to claw their way through concrete walls with their bare hands, their fingernails torn off, desperate to escape. One shelter beneath a hospital contained 300 people, patients, staff, refugees who had sought safety there. When rescuers opened it 3 days later, they found 300 corpses. The heat had been so intense that the bodies had mummified rather than decomposing. At 1:30 a.m. on February 14th, 3 hours after the first wave, the second wave arrived, 529 Lancaster bombers. The crews could see Dresden burning from 100 miles away. The glow from the fires was visible on the horizon, a red dome of light reflected off the clouds. As they approached the target, they flew through smoke rising to 15,000 feet. The thermal currents from the firestorm tossed the aircraft around like toys. Some crews reported their bombers being lifted or dropped by 1,000 feet in seconds. They dropped their loads anyway, another 1,800 tons of high explosives and incendiaries onto a city that was already burning. The second wave wasn't targeting military installations. There was nothing left to target. The fires had consumed the city center. The second wave was bombing fires, adding fuel to an inferno that was already out of control. The official justification: targeting rescue workers and firefighters. The second wave would catch them while they were trying to save the city, killing emergency responders and preventing any recovery. It worked exactly as planned. Fire brigades from surrounding towns had rushed to Dresden after the first wave, trying to contain the fires. When the second wave hit, they were caught in the open. Many were killed directly by bombs. Others were driven back by the intensifying fires. Any organized firefighting response became impossible. The city burned uncontrolled. Lothar Metzger had taken shelter in a basement during the first wave. When the bombing paused, he emerged to find his street unrecognizable. The buildings were gone, not damaged, not burning, but gone. Collapsed into rubble. The fires had consumed everything combustible, and the heat had caused the remaining stone and brick to crumble. He could see bodies in the rubble. Some were buried under collapsed buildings. Others had been caught in the firestorm, their corpses shrunken to the size of children by the intense heat, their bodies charred black and frozen in positions of agony. The Elbe River, which ran through the center of Dresden, had become a death trap. Thousands of people had fled to the river, trying to escape the fires. They waded into the water or clung to the bridges. The firestorm created its own wind patterns, generating tornado-like vortices that moved across the landscape. One of these fire tornadoes swept across the Elbe, igniting the people in and around the water. The river was wide enough that people couldn't swim across before the heat caught them. They died in the water, boiled alive or suffocated by the superheated air. Bodies floated downstream for days, thousands of them, some burned beyond recognition, others drowned trying to escape the fires. The most horrific deaths occurred in the Grosser Garten, Dresden's largest park. Thousands of refugees had fled to the park during the raid, believing that open ground away from buildings would be safe. The firestorm swept through the park like a wave. Trees exploded from the heat, the grass ignited, people caught in the open had nowhere to hide. Witnesses who survived on the edges of the park described seeing thousands of people burning simultaneously, a sea of flames where each flame was a human being. The screaming was so loud it could be heard over the roar of the fire. Most died quickly, losing consciousness from heat and smoke inhalation within seconds. Some survived longer, running while on fire, their clothes and hair burning until they collapsed and died. When daylight came on February 14th, the fires were still burning, but the firestorm had subsided. The wind had dropped. The temperature had decreased from 1,800 degrees to merely 800–900 degrees, still hot enough to ignite wood, but not hot enough to spontaneously combust human beings. Survivors emerged from shelters and ruins to find their city destroyed. The entire historic center of Dresden was gone. The Frauenkirche, the Church of Our Lady, a Baroque masterpiece that had stood for 200 years, had collapsed. The Semperoper Opera House was gutted. The Zwinger Palace was damaged beyond recognition. The old town that had survived centuries was now rubble and ash. And everywhere bodies. They lay in the streets by the hundreds. They floated in the river by the thousands. They were buried in collapsed shelters. They were piled in parks where people had tried to flee. The body count was impossible to calculate. Many corpses had been completely incinerated, nothing left but ash and bone fragments. Others had been buried under rubble and would take weeks to excavate. Still others had been swept away by the river. Initial estimates ranged from 25,000 to 200,000 plus dead. The actual number would be debated for decades. At noon on February 14th, while the city was still burning, the Americans arrived. 311 B-17 flying fortresses bombed Dresden in daylight, targeting the rail yards and whatever industrial facilities might have survived the night raids. The crews reported seeing almost no anti-aircraft fire. Dresden's defenses had been destroyed. The city was defenseless. They dropped another 771 tons of bombs on a city that was already dead. The final attack served no military purpose. The rail yards had been destroyed in the night raids. The factories were burning. The city was evacuated. The Americans were bombing rubble and corpses. But the mission had been planned, so the mission was executed. The aftermath of the Dresden raids created a humanitarian crisis that overwhelmed everyone trying to respond. The city's infrastructure was destroyed. No running water, no electricity, no hospitals, they had burned along with everything else. No food distribution system, no civil authority. And tens of thousands of bodies decomposing in the rubble. Nazi authorities commandeered every available truck and forced surviving civilians to help collect corpses. The bodies were stacked in the Altmarkt, the old market square, in piles 10 feet high. There were too many to bury. The ground was frozen. Excavating graves for 25,000 plus people would take months. Instead, they burned them. Massive funeral pyres were constructed in the Altmarkt. Hundreds of bodies at a time were soaked in gasoline and set alight. The pyres burned for 2 weeks, consuming corpses 24 hours a day. The smell was indescribable. Survivors reported that the stench of burning human flesh pervaded the entire city for weeks. You could taste it in the air. It soaked into clothing and skin. There was no escaping it. Some bodies were never recovered. They had been completely incinerated in the firestorm, leaving nothing but ash that mixed with the rubble. Others were buried in collapsed buildings that were never excavated. The buildings were simply demolished with the bodies still inside. The final death toll remains disputed. Nazi propaganda initially claimed 200,000 plus deaths, trying to portray the bombing as a war crime. This figure was propaganda, intended to turn neutral countries against the Allies. Post-war German sources estimated 35,000 deaths. Modern historians, after examining all available evidence, generally accept 22,000 as the most likely figure. 25,000 people dead in a single night. More than died in the entire London Blitz. More than would die weeks later in the atomic bombing of Nagasaki. And unlike Hiroshima or Nagasaki, Dresden served no clear military purpose. The strategic justification for the raid collapsed immediately after the war. The rail yards were operational again within days. German troop movements to the Eastern Front were barely disrupted. The Soviet advance was not significantly aided. The bombing of Dresden killed 25,000 people and destroyed one of Europe's most beautiful cities, and accomplished essentially nothing militarily. Churchill himself expressed doubts about the raid. In a memo written days after the bombing, he questioned whether the continuation of area bombing was justified now that Germany was clearly defeated. Air Marshal Harris defended the raid, arguing that every German city that supported the war effort was a legitimate target. Dresden had factories. Dresden had rail yards. Dresden housed German troops and refugees who would return to support the war effort if given the chance. But even Harris's defenders struggled to justify the firestorm. The first wave could be defended as targeting infrastructure. The second wave, deliberately timed to kill rescue workers, was harder to justify. The American daylight raid on an already destroyed city was nearly impossible to defend. Lothar Metzger survived the firestorm by hiding in a cellar that happened to have ventilation connecting to an undamaged section of sewer system, providing just enough oxygen to prevent suffocation. When he emerged on February 15th, he found that his family was dead. His mother, father, and 2 sisters had been in a public shelter that suffocated. Their bodies were among the hundreds stacked in the Altmarkt waiting to be burned. Metzger was forced to help carry his own family members to the funeral pyre and watch them burn. He lived until 2013, 68 years carrying the memory of that night. In interviews late in life, he was asked if he blamed the Allies for the bombing. His answer: "I blame the Nazis for starting a war that made Dresden a target. I blame Hitler for refusing to surrender when defeat was certain. I blame the German people for supporting a regime that committed atrocities across Europe. But I also believe that what happened in Dresden was unnecessary. The war was over. Germany was defeated." Burning 25,000 civilians alive accomplished nothing except adding to the mountain of corpses that the war had already created. Both things can be true. Germany deserved to lose the war. Dresden did not deserve to burn. Margaret Freyer, who survived by hiding in the boiling fountain, never fully recovered. She suffered from severe burns that required years of treatment. She developed what would now be diagnosed as PTSD, unable to sleep without nightmares, unable to hear sirens without panic attacks. She wrote extensively about her experience, hoping to document what happened. Her memoir was published in 1953 and immediately became controversial. Some praised it as important testimony. Others condemned it as victim playing, trying to generate sympathy for Germans when Germany had committed far worse atrocities. Freyer's response: "I am not asking for sympathy. I am asking for honesty. The Holocaust was a unique evil that Germany perpetrated. Nothing justifies what was done to the Jews, the Roma, the Poles, the Russians. But Dresden also happened. 25,000 people also burned. Acknowledging one horror does not diminish the other." The debate over Dresden continues 80 years later. Was it a legitimate military operation targeting a transportation hub? Or was it an unnecessary terror bombing of a refugee-filled city that served no strategic purpose? Was it payback for German bombing of British cities? Or was it a war crime comparable to German atrocities? Can both sides of that argument be true simultaneously? Modern historians generally conclude Dresden had some military value as a transportation hub, but far less than major industrial cities that were not bombed. The scale of the attack was disproportionate to any military objective, the deliberate creation of a firestorm intended to maximize civilian casualties was ethically questionable. The second wave, time to kill rescue workers, crossed into revenge rather than military necessity. The raid accomplished little militarily while creating massive civilian casualties, but historians also note Germany had pioneered terror bombing earlier in the war. German authorities had concentrated refugees in Dresden, making civilian casualties inevitable. The Allied bombing campaign overall shortened the war and saved lives by forcing German surrender. Individual raids must be judged in the context of total war. The truth is complicated. Dresden was neither the worst atrocity of World War II nor a completely justified military operation. It exists in the moral gray zone where most of history actually lives. 25,000 people died in Dresden on the night of February 13, 1945. They died in a firestorm that generated 100 mph winds and 1,800-degree temperatures. They burned alive, boiled alive, suffocated in shelters, drowned in rivers trying to escape flames. They died because Allied bombers dropped 3,900 tons of explosives and incendiaries on a city packed with refugees. They died unnecessarily. The war was weeks from ending. Germany was defeated. Dresden had minimal military value. But they also died because Germany started a war that killed 60 million people. Because German bombers had incinerated Rotterdam, Warsaw, and London. Because the Nazi regime had committed atrocities that demanded total defeat. Both truths exist simultaneously. Dresden was a tragedy. Dresden was also a consequence. And 25,000 people died caught between those two truths. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to share this with more people who need to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you the complicated moral truths of history every single day. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. This story doesn't have easy answers. History rarely does. 25,000 people died in Dresden. They deserve to be remembered, not as propaganda, not as justification, but as human beings who died in a war that consumed everything it touched. Thank you for watching. Thank you for engaging with difficult history. Thank you for understanding that truth is more complex than we want it to be.